Good morning. I am into my third decade of being a priest. Don't let my youthfulness fool you. And over these years, I've had a similar conversation over and over again. And someone comes to me and is struggling reading the Bible. Maybe they're trying to read a portion of it. Maybe it's the portion we read on Sunday morning. Maybe they're trying to go cover to cover with it, but they're struggling with the arcane language and the arcane names, and they say things to me like, Rick, I'm not a historian, I'm not an archaeologist. How do I figure out what this thing means? And so one of the many tools that I try to give people in that situation is an old tool. It sounds very contemporary, but it has been taught for centuries, and particularly works in the narrative sections of the Bible, the story sections, is you put yourself into the story. You step into the sandals of the people that are in the story, and you experience the story from their perspective. So, for example, a story that we all know probably pretty well, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So when wrestling with the parable of the Good Samaritan, you might put the sandals of the Good Samaritan on, and you're on a road, you're traveling from A to B, but on the road, you look in the ditch, and there's a guy, and he's in trouble. Now, you're a Samaritan, and he's Jewish, so you're different. He dresses differently than you and eats differently than you and worships differently than you. And sometimes that might matter, but on this day, when things seem to be life and death, those things don't matter. And so you jump off your horse. And you don't just throw money his way, but you jump into the ditch with him. And with your own hands, you care for him and save his life. And so from the perspective of the Good Samaritan, this is a story about loving your neighbor as yourself, which is exactly why Jesus tells the story. But it's about loving your neighbor not as just having warm, fuzzy feelings towards the guy in the ditch, but by actually caring with your hands and yourself, giving that other person everything you have and everything you are in service. Now, when using this tool of going through the scriptures, it's important to not just cast yourself as the hero of the story. Because, friends, we're not always the hero. And so you might take off the sandals of the Good Samaritan and put on the sandals of the priest and the Levite who had passed by a little earlier on the same day, on the same road, and saw the same guy in the same ditch, but who decided not to get off their horse and to get into the ditch, but decided, I'm running kind of late. I'm needed at the temple. My robes are freshly laundered. That looks messy. Surely someone else will deal with it. We've probably, all of us, been the Good Samaritan at some point in our lives. I hope you've all had that experience of helping somebody in extraordinary ways. But we've also probably all had the experience of, I'd just rather not get involved in this one. I have. I've been that priest. I've been that Levite. I'm not proud of it, but I've been there. And I wish later that I made a different decision. And so, from this perspective, this story is about loving your neighbor as yourself, but it's about loving your neighbor as yourself as requiring a change in priorities. Loving our neighbor requires us sometimes to give things up, like being on time or having freshly dry cleaned clothes on. Sometimes love requires greater things of us. Take off those sandals and put on the sandals of the guy who's in the ditch, who got beat up by the robbers on his way somewhere and laying there helpless. And within an inch of his life, somebody joins him in the ditch to help. And it's not someone he knows, and it's not someone like him. It's a Samaritan, someone who looks different and dresses different and eats different and worships different. And he's come to help. I don't know if you're like me, but I would most of the time prefer to gnaw my own arm off than ask someone else for help and to take someone's help. And so in this case, the story is about loving your neighbor as yourself, but not as about giving the love, but as receiving the love. That we don't just get to be the dispensers of grace and mercy and love, but sometimes we have to receive it and receive that grace with grace. And then we can take those sandals off and we can put on the sandals of the robbers who beat the guy up and put him in the ditch to begin with. Now this is true, I have never been in a fight. I've never hit anyone, and I hope never to. I've never physically put someone in a ditch, but I have put a lot of people in metaphorical ditches. And sometimes I've done it inadvertently, and sometimes in less mature times I did it vertently. And so this story is about what does God require of us, not just on our best days when we make our best choices, but how do we love our neighbor on our worst days when our worst angels are afoot? Do you see how this goes? Wrestling with the story from the perspective of different characters. And we didn't have to learn a single Greek word, and we didn't have to learn a single archaeological feature of the ancient world. We just stepped into their sandals and experienced the story from their perspective. So let's bring that tool to our Old Testament lesson today, which does have some archaic features to it. Let's put on the sandals of Eli. Eli is the priest of Shiloh. Shiloh is this center of worship. It's sort of a transitory center of worship. The temple in Jerusalem hasn't yet been built, and the Ark of the Covenant is sort of stuck here in Shiloh until further notice. And so people are coming to worship and to pray and to offer sacrifices to God at this Ark of the Covenant, at this shrine, and Eli is the priest who's trying to make all of this happen. And when people go to Shiloh to worship, to pray, to offer sacrifice, there is an acceptable sort of range of behavior. Sort of like the acceptable range of behavior that we bring with us to St. David's on a Sunday morning. You drive your car slowly through the parking lot. You park your car. You come into the church smiling, taking your bulletin from the usher. You go and you put on your name tag, and then you come in and we sit in quiet and listen attentively to the sermon. And then we stand, we sit, we kneel, we stand, we sit, and we kneel. And then we leave this place, putting our name tag back where it belongs. And going off to the hall to have some fellowship, eat some cookies, go to the forum, go to the lectionary Bible study, and then leave this place with a smile on our face. That's the acceptable range of what we do here. And so when someone comes and they step outside of that acceptable range, it makes us a little uncomfortable, which is what happens on this day at Shiloh, for a woman comes whose name is Hannah. And Hannah is weeping and wailing and rocking and like muttering to herself. She looks to Eli like she is drunk. And Eli goes and says to her, "You are drunk. Get your act together or get out of here." Years ago, years ago, back when Karen and I were just dating. We went on a sailing trip in the Chesapeake, and we stopped in a little store to get a bottle of wine. And Karen was wearing a baby doll dress. You know what a baby doll dress? It's like gathered here, but it sort of flares out. And so she grabbed this bottle of wine and she put it on the counter, and the cashier said, "Well, I hope that's not for you." And Karen's like, What do you mean? Well, in your condition. Friends, she was not in a condition. And when Karen told the cashier this, you could see the blood drain out of the cashier's face. If there's anything you get from the sermon this morning, don't do that, okay? Don't do that. In the story of Eli, it's a 3,000-year-old story, but you can watch the blood drain from Eli's face when Hannah tells Eli, "No, I am not drunk. I am deeply grieved, and I am bringing my pain and my shame, and I'm bringing it before the Lord." And you can watch Eli go, "Oh, peace be with you. Whatever you're praying for, I'm praying for too." And so, from Eli's perspective, this is a story about not making snap judgments. And if we make a snap judgment in our heart, to absolutely not let that snap judgment pass our lips. It is far easier to judge others than ourselves. We tend to judge ourselves in shades of gray because we know all the things that are going on inside of our heads, and we tend to judge others in black and white, never knowing what is going on in their lives. Take off Eli's rather uncomfortable sandals and put on the sandals of Peninnah. So this is where the story gets a little juicy. So there's a guy named Elkanah. Elkanah has a wife whose name is Hannah, but Elkanah has another wife whose name is Peninnah. If you have any questions, see Thomas after the service. He will be happy to explain that to you or to your children. So Peninnah sees Hannah's distress. Hannah has deep shame because she is unable to bear a child. It is all she wanted. In her day and age, that is where the worth of a woman came from. Peninnah saw her shame and her pain, and Peninnah delighted in her pain and her shame. And any chance she got, she just stuck a little stick into Hannah's pain and shame to make her cry and weep and wail and feel even worse about herself than she already did. Peninnah gets just this little mention in this book, but if you put her sandals on, you can see that Peninnah is a deeply wounded person. She has been hurt in her life. And like all people who have been hurt in our lives, and that's all of us, we have choices to make. We can make the choice to say, I am never going to pass this hurt I have on to other people, or we can cause the same pain in others that has been caused upon us. And that is the choice that Peninnah made. And so, from Peninnah's position in this story, this is a story about what we put out into the world. It is about what we do with our woundedness. And do we use our woundedness to perpetuate woundedness in the world? Take off her shoes and put on the far more comfortable shoes of Hannah. Hannah, who is deeply grieved, who is deeply shamed, who is deeply pained, but who does not take Peninnah's road. And she doesn't wallow in her shame. Shame can be a very isolating thing. We can just put it straight inside of ourselves and never want to speak it and just hold it alone as if no one else around us has ever known that feeling of shame before. But she does not do that. She takes all that pain and all that shame and all that hurt, and with everything she has and everything she is, she lays it at the feet of God at Shiloh. She doesn't let anything hold her back. She doesn't let convention or norms hold her back. She doesn't let other people thinking that she might be drunk hold her back. She just lets it go before God. She gives it over. After this and her interaction with Eli, Hannah breaks into song. It's a song that we read together in the place where we normally read a psalm. If Hannah's song felt comfortable or familiar at all, it may be because it is very similar to the song that Mary sings. Another woman who felt some shame, a young, teenage, unwed, pregnant woman. Now, yes, the father of her child was God, but did anyone believe her? Would you believe her? Oh, don't worry, God did this. No. Did her parents believe her, and her aunts and uncles, and her nosy neighbors, and her rabbi believe her? No. She had hurt everyone in her life. And what does she do with it? It's almost like she puts on the 1,000-year-old sandals of her ancient sister Hannah, and she goes to the home of her cousin Elizabeth, and she breaks out in a song that echoes Hannah's song, pouring everything she has and everything she is into praise of God. You see what we've done there? By putting on these sandals, these stories are 2,000 and 3,000 years old, and yet are their sandals all that different from our own shoes? And are the things that God asked of the Samaritan and the Levi and the priest and Elkanah and Peninnah and Hannah and Eli, are they anything different than God thousands of years later asks of us? But to be people of grace and mercy and love, who bring everything we have and everything we are to the feet of God.